Thank you so much for joining me today for this Birding Skill Builder workshop. I look forward to talking to you all today about one of my most favorite topics, and that's birds. Again, I'm Jessica Ruthenberg, watchful wildlife biologist with the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. So here's a quick little overview of what I'm going to be speaking about today. First, I'm just going to give you some real quick background on the agency that I work for and what I do for them in my position. And then we're going to talk a lot about birds. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background information on birds. And then we're going to talk a whole lot about birding. We're going to talk about what it is, why it's fun, how to identify birds is going to be the vast majority of our presentation today. And then I'm going to go through some helpful tools and equipment, and I have lots of tips about birding throughout the presentation. Okay, so again, I work for the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, and our agency's mission is really summed up in our tagline, conserve, connect, and protect. So we conserve wildlife populations and habitat. We work to connect people to Virginia's outdoors, and we do that through a wide variety of wildlife-related activities. And that's where I come in with my position with Watchable Wildlife. And then we also work to protect people and property by promoting safe outdoor experiences and managing human and wildlife conflicts. So what I do for the DWR is I'm a watchable wildlife biologist, and I'm one of two of biologists who manage our watchable wildlife program. And our program is all about increasing support for wildlife conservation and doing that by engaging people in wildlife viewing. So our program has a few different components. First and foremost, we work to promote wildlife viewing, nature tourism, and outdoor recreation. We largely do that by coordinating the statewide Virginia Bird and Wildlife Trail, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. We also work to provide wildlife viewing opportunities such as this Winter Wildlife Festival. So our agency is a major sponsor of this festival, and we help in the planning and participate in it. And then we also do a lot of informational resources too about wildlife viewing as well. So lots of different components to the work that we do. And finally, what we also do is we work to promote opportunities for people to support conservation. We do that through different outreach and supporting community science efforts and promoting our agency's conservation funds, like our Restore the Wild Fund, which works to conserve habitat in Virginia. Okay, so now we're going to get into the presentation. We're going to talk a lot about birding now. So what is birding? Birding is the hobby of carefully observing birds in their natural habitat. Over 400 species of birds can be observed in Virginia. So Virginia is a really fabulous place to be for birding with the wide diversity of birds that we have. And birding is a really wonderful activity. It's a fun thing to do. It's restorative, and it's very rewarding. So some of the reasons why I love birding so much is because birds, they're just the coolest. They're super fascinating, really interesting. They evolved from dinosaurs. They're basically like the living dinosaurs of today. And they're also beautiful. So they have striking colors and patterns. They're beautiful to listen to. So they bring, music into our lives as well. And the birds also connect us to nature. One of the reasons I love birding is because you can do it from anywhere. And so even when you're indoors, say watching birds out at your feeder, you can feel this sort of connection with the natural world. So they really kind of sweep you into nature by making their presence, kind of known around us all the time, wherever we are. And then birding, it's also really great for your health, actually. So, but not just physically by being outdoors, it's good in that regards because it gets you outdoors and moving, but by also being outdoors in nature, it's also very, mentally restorative and good for your mental health as well. And having that connection with nature is really, really beneficial. Also, birding is a wonderful way to meet people. So it's actually can be quite a social activity. There's lots of bird clubs that you can join. There's birding festivals like this one, the Winter Wildlife Festival. You can go out on field trips. There's lots of birding social media groups that you can join and communicate with other people about birding and the birds that you see and your passion for the activity. So there's a lot of reasons to love birding. Again, I'll just emphasize I really love it because you can do it from anywhere. And the more you get into birding, it really starts to become part of your lifestyle where you just find yourself doing it all the time, wherever you go. And if you really start to get into birding, you're going to be in really good company because there's over 45 million people who consider themselves birders in the United States. So again, it is a great way to meet people as well. Okay, so now I'm going to talk more about the incredible creatures that we call birds. So here's a little bit of background information on birds for you. So I mentioned there's 400 species of birds in Virginia, but worldwide there's 10,000 species of birds to discover. But given all of the diversity of all these different bird species, all birds share a certain set of characteristics that makes them a bird. So all birds have feathers, and feathers protect birds. They also provide thermal regulation, so they keep them warm and insulated, protected from the elements. All birds have wings, but I will note that not all birds fly. So if you think about birds like ostrich, that's a bird that does not fly. Now birds like a penguin, penguins are kind of interesting because even though they don't fly per se, the manner in which they swim underwater is very much the style of how a bird flies. So that's kind of an interesting thing to note. And then all birds have a beak. Now, a lot of birders will refer to the beak as a bill, and that's what I call it, and we'll call it in this presentation. And then female birds lay eggs. And so their eggs, they're hard and they have waterproof shells. And the more you start to observe birds, if you've ever had a nest that you were watching, say in your backyard, you might have noticed how those parent birds work really, really hard to take care of their young. They really provide extensive care for their young. In some cases, certain species will get another bird to look after their young. So there are some birds like cowbirds, for example, that will lay their egg in another bird's nest and let that other bird take care of their young for them. And then all birds are vertebrates, so they have a backbone just like we do, and all birds are warm-blooded. So they regulate, which means that they regulate their body temperature internally, also just like how we do. All right, so now we're going to move on to talk about bird identification. There are 7 keys to bird identification that I'm going to walk you through in this presentation. I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of these 7 keys. So the first 2 are location and time of year. And then there's habitat, size and shape, behavior and movement, sound, and the final one is their colors and patterns, which can also be referred to as field marks. So now I'm going to go through all 7 of these keys to identification in a lot more detail. So starting off with geographic location. So thinking about where you were when you saw a bird can play a really vital role in making a quick identification in some cases. So I have an example for you of how location can come into play. So if you look at the 2 birds pictured here, they look really similar. We have a black-capped chickadee and a Carolina chickadee, and they look nearly identical. But if you were to look at the ranges of where these 2 species are found, you can see that it's quite different. So a black-capped chickadee is found more in the northern United States or Canada. And let me back up for a second. So what I'm showing you here, these are called range maps, and any good field guide will have maps such as you see here to show you where birds can be found. So what you're seeing pictured here are the range maps for these two species. And the purple color is showing where they are found on a year-round basis. So for the black-capped chickadees range, you're seeing that it's found, again, in the northern United States or Canada. But for the Carolina, it's found in the southeastern United States. So if you are seeing a bird that looks like one of these and you're in the Virginia Beach area, you'd be really safe to assume that what you were seeing was a Carolina chickadee just based on location alone. Now, however, if you were, say, looking here, let me go back to the map here. If you were in, say, Harrisonburg, so more in the mountains of Virginia, more closer to northern Virginia, you're kind of starting to get into that edge of where black-capped chickadees range, and it would be much more likely if you saw a bird like that, that it was a black-capped chickadee than the Carolina. And so here's how this would all look if you were to open up a field guide as a book. You'd see the different species of chickadee and then would have the range maps there, and you could refer to those to help make that identification. Okay, so here's another consideration. It was about season. So the time of year in which you saw a bird also can inform its identification. And here's another example for you. So here I have pictured of a wood thrush and a picture of a hermit thrush. So they are not quite identical, but they look very, very similar. But you can quickly make an identification of one of these species based on the time of year and in looking at a range map. So for the range maps for these species, you're seeing a lot more colors here because there's some changes based on season as to where they are found. So for the wood thrush, you can see in Virginia, they are found here during the summertime, versus the hermit thrush, which is found in Virginia largely in the winter time, except for in some of our more mountainous areas, they can be found there year round. So again, you know, here, say if you're in Virginia Beach and you saw a bird that looked like one of these and it was the summertime, you'd be pretty safe to assume that what you were seeing was a wood thrush. But if you were seeing it in the wintertime, you would want to make that ID as the hermit thrush. And again, here's how this would look in a field guide book. I'll talk more about field guides towards the end of this presentation, but I just want to show you how that would look. You could like open up to the thrush section of the book and find range maps like this to help you make that ID. Okay, the next key to bird identification is habitat, and thinking about where the bird was hanging out when you saw it can be important and informative. So just to make sure everyone understands what a habitat is a word that describes, you know, the place where an animal finds all of its food, its water, its shelter, and the space that it needs to survive. So all four of those components, that's what makes up a bird habitat. And I have here some different examples of habitats you could find, you know, in Virginia. We have our coastal areas, so beaches can be a habitat. Our mountains and mountain forests are a different kind of habitat. And then there's agricultural areas or big open fields. You know, here in southeastern Virginia, we have swamps in our woodlands, and also just a garden, a native plant garden you might have in your backyard can be a habitat, or a river and open water. So, you know, different species of birds, they have different habitat needs. So that the suite of species you would find at the beach would be different than the suite of species that you would see if you were out in the woods and the mountains, or, you know, out on a farm versus out in a swamp in the middle of the woods. So I'm going to show you here another example of how habitat can come into play in making an identification of a bird. So here again, I have two similar species, or similar looking species rather. So they look, you know, not quite identical, but look really closely alike, but they have different habitats. And you could find this out by opening up a field guide. So if you saw a bird that looked like that and you weren't sure, you could go in and like read about its habitat, and you'll see that they're different. So for the marsh wren, the field guide here describes that they're common in marshes of cattails or reeds, Whereas for the Carolina wren, they're common in a dense, brushy tangle within woods. So if you were in the middle of the woods, no water around, and you saw, a bird that looked, like one of these wrens, you could be pretty safe to choose a Carolina wren as one of the species that you might have seen. But if you were, for example, out at a marsh and you saw a wren that looked like this in that marsh, you'd be pretty safe to assume that it was the marsh wren. Now, where it could get interesting is, say you were in an area where there was a marsh that was bordered by a woodland. Well, then in that case, you could potentially be seeing either species. So you'd have to then look at some other characteristics and keys to bird identification to really be sure. All right, the next component of bird identification I want to talk about is size and shape. So size and shape can often form your first impression of a bird and start getting what starts to spark your mind into thinking about what bird species you might have seen. And in many cases, sometimes, size and silhouette, that might be all you get to see about a given bird. Sometimes, the lighting's not great, the bird might be backlit, or sometimes it's just flying overhead and you can't really see any other details. So you just got to go by, what you've got. And these kinds of silhouettes and relative size, it actually can be really informative. So we are going to try out being a little interactive here in this presentation for a moment. So you can go ahead and type in the chat if you have a guess about the birds below, starting with the one on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. And then Molly, if you're seeing some responses, just let me know what you're seeing there.
Okay, I unmuted myself. So we're getting a lot of hummingbirds already.
Okay, very good. So everyone who's guessing hummingbird is correct. So let's try the next bird next to the hummingbird.
Okay, next bird. I have one sparrow, two sparrows. Someone said a finch for the next one.
Well, these are all good guesses. I will say that sparrow is the correct answer, but finch is certainly a good guess as well, based on the information the limited amount of information that you have there. Let's try the next one.
Next one, people are saying robin.
Awesome, very good. You are correct. And the next one?
The next one. Someone says crow, crow, crow. We're getting crows across the board.
Awesome. It's kind of easy because crows are also, solid blackbirds. So that's very good. And then the last one.
Goose.
Awesome. You guys all did wonderful. So as you can see, you might have been surprised to find out that even with just this limited amount of information, you're able to identify what bird you saw there. And one other thing I want to mention about observing the silhouette of a bird and shape and things like that is to always be sure to check out the bird's bill. This is kind of like a theme I'm going to say in this presentation is that in the bird ID, it's really all in the details. You really want to observe everything that you can about the bird in order to identify it. And one of the really key things to look at is the shape of its bill. And that's because different family groups of birds, different species of birds, they have different shaped bills. So it can really be informative. So take a look at the birds here that I have examples of on the screen and look at the bill of this cardinal here. Look how triangular it is. It's also rather large for the size of its head. And then we have our eagle. And of course it has that massive bill and that hooked bill that so many birds of prey or raptors have. And then compare that to this teeny tiny stubby bill of this Carolina chickadee. So a pretty diminutive bill there. And then compare that down here at the bottom of your screen, bottom left of the Carolina wren. And it has this kind of long skinny bill that curves downward. And that's usually referred to as a decurved bill. And then compare that to the hummingbird in the middle, bottom middle. So it's that long, straight bill that's kind of works like a straw. And then, of course, there's ducks with their broad, flat duck bills that they have. So that's always going to be really helpful in narrowing down what bird you're looking at is by noticing the bill. So to get started in familiarizing yourself with size and shape and silhouettes of birds, is what you really want to do is study a guidebook. So guidebooks will often have pages that'll show you the whole family group of birds. And you can kind of flip through those family groups pages and start to learn these silhouettes. So I have a bunch of different water birds here that I'm going to flip through, and you can kind of just quickly notice how much their silhouettes vary. So here are the shorebirds. You can see they have these sort of very pointed tails, kind of tiny heads, long bills, long legs, but they're also kind of smaller birds overall. And then compare that to gulls, which are much like more heavy-bodied than the shorebirds are. And then there's ducks. So they're longer bodied, they're very squat, they have those duck bills. And then compare that to wading birds. And they have those long, skinny legs. A lot of them have long, tall necks. Some of them are kind of lanky. There's a few that are a little more stocky, but they all kind of have the same sort of general features, particularly the long legs. All right, so now we're going to move on to talk about behavior and how behavior can inform a bird identification. So starting off with social behavior. So one question to ask yourself when you saw a bird was whether or not it was hanging out with other birds. That's because some birds are really social, where they'll flock with other birds, whereas other birds can be more solitary. They really prefer to be alone. So the European starlings all hanging out on the telephone wires, that's a great example of a really social species that's often seen in flocks. Whereas a belted kingfisher, like you see here in this picture, they're usually seen alone, all by themselves. So that's a more solitary type of species. You also can kind of, it's important to observe the feeding behavior of a bird. So if you see a bird eating, think about where it was eating and how it was eating. Because this can vary from different family groups and different species as well. So some birds, they'll forage for their food, what's termed as on the wing, which means that they collect food, like this tree swallow catches insects while it's flying out in the air over fields, versus other birds like this eastern towhee, which will scrounge around for food on the ground. And then there's woodpeckers, which almost always are feeding on tree trunks. And then there's other birds like warblers, which will be feeding rather than on the trunk of the tree, they'll be out on the branches of the tree, maybe gleaning insects or picking fruit or berries. I really like this illustration here because it shows how even within a given habitat, because this kind of feeding behavior, it's all kind of interrelated with a bird's habitat. But even the birds who might all have a woodland habitat in common, they will prefer to occupy different parts of the woodlands, like layers, based on what it is that they like to eat and how they eat. So if you look at this picture here, you can see there's certain species that are down on the forest floor picking food, insects probably through the leaf litter, whereas there's other birds who might be eating nuts or seeds way up high in the tree canopies. And then there's other bird species that might be more hanging out in the shrubs or smaller trees, eating the insects there, or maybe they're eating fruit. So these different, like thinking through that kind of layer of the forest of where you saw the bird can also be helpful in, again, in informing an identification. Okay, then another aspect of bird behavior that's informative is a bird's flight style. So sometimes when you see a bird, all you get is that flyby, and it's gone before you know it. And you can actually sometimes identify birds even just as it's flying by considering the manner in which it was flying. So some birds fly in a really straight flight path. Whereas other birds have more of an undulating flight path. And you can see this variation in that diagram there. So take a look at the duck's flight path. So ducks fly very straight, very direct flight path, whereas gulls and finches have kind of a bouncy flight of up and down, and gulls kind of undulate more gradually. And then there's also another consideration aspect of flight style is wing beats. And by wing beats, I mean how fast and how often a bird is flapping its wings. So again, take a look at the duck and its wing beats there. So ducks flap their wings really, really fast. They look like they're in a huge hurry to get wherever it is that they're going, versus a gull, which flaps its wings much more slowly. They kind of fly like they've got all day to get where it is that they're going. Whereas finches do something that's called a flap and glide style of flight. So they'll flap their wings really quick, and then they'll glide a little, and then flap a little more, and then glide a little. So that's another style of flight. And then there's other birds, like raptors and vultures that are more of type of birds that will be soaring and doing a lot less flapping. So a turkey vulture is a good example of a bird that soars. One thing that's unique about turkey vultures and like distinguishing them from other soaring birds of prey is that they have kind of what's called like a teetering or wobbly kind of flight path, where they're kind of look like they're getting thrown around a little by the wind. Whereas other raptors fly like really, really direct and aren't tossed around like that at all. And vultures often will hold their wings in a V. So that's just something else to look at. And it kind of relates to silhouette. So you can observe a bird in flight by this flight style and sometimes identify it by noting, the silhouette and this flight style. All right, now we're going to move into talk about sound. And sound is a really important part of birding and bird identification. It really pays off to listen carefully to birds. This is because birds have very unique songs and calls, and that can really sometimes be the best way to identify a bird. So just to inform you here, I often get the question about what's the difference between a song and a call. So songs are more complex. They're more musical, meaning that they will raise and lower in pitch. And they also tend to have a pattern, whereas calls are really short and simple. Also, the way in which a bird uses a song versus a call is different. So bird song is used mostly by the males, although some females sing, and it's usually the males trying to attract a mate or to defend their territory. Now, when birds call, this is done by both males and females, and it's usually an alarm call. Sometimes it's to maintain communication if they're hanging out in a group. Some birds will have a certain call they'll make while they're flying, or it might be the young begging for their parents to come. So that's what calls are used for. So I'm going to play an example here for you of the difference between a song and a call here with the sounds of the northern cardinal. So listen, I'm going to play the cardinal song, which is a series of loud, kind of slurred sounding whistles that have a sort of upward swept pitch to them. Okay, so that's the song of the northern cardinal. Now I'm going to play its call, which is much more simple, much shorter, it makes this sort of metallic sounding chip note. Okay, so hopefully there you're kind of gathering that difference between the song and the call, where the song's more complex, it's more musical sounding, it has a pattern, and then the call is just really, really short and simple. And sometimes, listening to birds is so important because sometimes a song or call, it might be the only way to tell similar looking species apart. So a great example of that here is kind of a local example we have in the Virginia Beach area of the American crow and the fish crow. So again, here are two birds who look basically identical to one another and really can only truly be distinguished if you listen to it and hear it make its call. So the American crow makes sort of that classic crow call where it's saying caw, caw. Now I'm going to compare that to the fish crow, which has a much different call and sounds pretty nasal. So an easy way to remember this, the distinguishing calls of the American crow versus the fish crow is with this little silly joke. If you see a crow and you look at it, is you can ask the crow, "Are you an American crow?" And if the crow responds, then you know that what you've got is the fish crow there. So it's just a kind of easy trick to help you remember when you're out in the field, which call it is that you are hearing and which bird it is. All right, so another tip I have for you about bird songs and calls is when you're starting off trying to learn them, is to begin by listening for the quality of the song or call. So I have a few examples here of some of the different qualities that you might hear, and I'm playing these not for you to try to memorize them right now, but really just kind of listen again for how different one song sounds from the next in terms of the quality of the sound. So here I'm going to play the robin, which sounds very musical, a sort of whistle that it has. All right, now compare that here to this great blue heron, which has a very harsh call. And then here is a prairie warbler, which is a really great example of how some birds can sound very sort of buzzy in the song that they sing. Okay, and now compare that one here to this white-breasted nuthatch, which has a very nasal sounding call, or song rather. And then other birds will have more of a trill as part of their song, or sometimes their call is a trill. So here is the red-winged blackbird, which will give a couple nice little sounding notes, and then it has a long trill. And again, so I hope that gives you a sense of the variation that you can hear in sort of the auditory environment as you're listening for birds. And then the last tip I have here for you as you're trying to learn about bird sounds is to use mnemonics. Mnemonics are basically just a tool that you can use for recognizing a bird song or call in the field. So it's often said that a lot of these bird mnemonics sound like certain words or phrases. And it may seem so silly, but I have to say it really, really does pay off in helping you to learn these songs and to recognize them when you're outside trying to figure out what you're hearing. So I'm going to play some examples for you. So the tufted titmouse is often described as sounding like it's saying Peter, Peter, Peter in its song. So I'll play it and listen for that, see if you can hear that. All right, so that was the tufted titmouse. And now the blue jay, its call that it makes sounds like it's saying its own name, which makes it easy to remember. So it has a very harsh call where it repeats J, J, J. And then here's one of my favorite mnemonics of all. This is the barred owl, which is often described as sounding like it's singing, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" So that was the barred owl. And now I'm going to play the Eastern towhee, which often sounds like it's saying, drink your tea, drink your tea. Kind of trills the T at the end there. Okay, now for the Carolina chickadee, I'm going to play first its song, and then I'm going to play its call. Again, you'll hear that difference between a song and a call with these. The song, sometimes these mnemonics, they're not always like a real word. Sometimes it's sort of a gibberish word, but it's a way to describe, still what it is that you're hearing. So for the Carolina chickadee, people often describe it as sounding like it's saying Phoebe, Phoebe. The one clever person I heard once say that they thought it sounded like it was saying, find it on eBay. So it's kind of like whatever works for you to help you remember is a good mnemonic. And now the call of the Carolina chickadee, this is another bird that says sort of its own name, that last syllable of its name that it sort of repeats, dee, 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 dee. Okay, and you might recall I mentioned earlier was that some birds have a certain song or call that they'll make when they're flying. And American goldfinches are one of the species that will do that. And when they're flying, it sounds like they're saying potato chip, potato chip. And then this last example that I'm going to give to you here is the Carolina wren. This is a really good bird for you to familiarize yourself with because it's a really vocal bird. There's a few different mnemonics people use for its song. It actually sings a whole bunch of different phrases, but there's one particular phrase that people use to try and remember it. And they'll describe that phrase as sounding like it's saying Germany, 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 or some people think it sounds like tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle, or others might describe it as sounding like Tweety bird, Tweety bird, Tweety bird. When I was a kid, I thought it was saying cheeseburger, cheeseburger, cheeseburger. So again, it's really like whatever mnemonic works for you, helps you recognize that bird song is just fine. So let's listen to the Carolina wren. Let me play that one more time because that was kind of fast. All right, so again, my goal with playing all of these sounds for you is not for you to walk away from this presentation having memorized them, but really just to give you a sense of how to listen for bird songs and calls, how to distinguish them, and to understand the diversity of bird songs and calls that exist out there. So now we're going to move on to talking about field marks. And field marks, again, this is referring to the colors and patterns of a bird's plumage. So again, I'm just going to say it again, to observe birds as close as possible. This is really all about the details when it comes to birds and making these identifications and distinguishing, one species from the next. And so I have a diagram here. It shows the parts of a bird's body. And any one of these body parts could be a different color or have a certain marking on it. It's good to get to know these words because these are sort of the words that birders will use to describe how a bird looks to one another. And they're the words that will be used in a field guide when you're trying to make an identification. So some birds have really detailed markings, and this can be found sometimes on faces, like this white-throated sparrow in this diagram. Look at so many different markings, and some of the really good words here to note are eye lines. So some birds have a stripe through their eye, and that's referred to as an eye line. Some birds will have a stripe over their eye, which is often called an eyebrow. It's important to always notice beak color on a bird as well. And some birds might even be so detailed that maybe their upper beak is a different color from their lower beak. Some birds might have, a patch on their throat, or they might have a stripe down their face that looks like a whisker mark. And then on bird wings, there are certain bird species that have wing bars on them, and that can be a really important marking to notice. Other bird species will have a patch of color on their wing, and that would just be referred to as a wing patch. So now we're going to test your observation skills a little bit. We're going to have you use the chat again. So Molly, I'm going to have to ask you to monitor the chat. I'm going to show you a few different species of birds, and I want you all to take a look at that bird and think about, its colors, its patterns, these field marks, and go ahead and write in the chat about which markings are kind of standing out to you that you're noticing and observing on that bird. And then Molly, go ahead and tell me what people are saying in the chat.
Will do. A dark head, red breast, yellow bill, eye ring.
Fabulous.
Yeah, the beak color.
Great. So now I'm just going to point them out to you. Yeah. So someone used the word eye ring, and that's a great bird word to use. That's a marking that a lot of different bird species will have. They'll have that white ring around the eye, like this bird has. Which if you can guess the species, you can go ahead and write that in the chat as well. But yeah, always good to notice bill color. So this bright yellow bill is important to see. And then that it has this whole black back and this red breast and belly. Those would be the sort of most distinguishing features on the bird. So Molly, did anyone put any guesses?
We have a guess for robin.
Okay, absolutely correct. So thank you. Okay, now here's another bird. And go ahead, again, type into the chat these sort of standout field marks that you're seeing on this bird here. And Molly, what kinds of descriptions are you seeing?
We've got the head crest, the side stripe, the size, white breast.
Okay. Very good. So those are all kind of the key things to notice about this particular species. So yeah, crest is a great word to use. So some birds have a crest, so that's that tall sort of triangular hat that this bird is wearing. You were noticing that it has this peach or rusty stripe on its side. That's a good feature to notice. Again, that white underside, that gray back. But also what's unique on this bird is that black patch above its bill that it has. So that's a little detail there that's unique on this species. If anyone has a guess on this bird, go ahead and type that into the chat as well.
I have several guesses for tufted titmouse.
Very good, you are correct. And our last bird example here. So go ahead, write into the chat about the field marks of this species. And Molly, what are you seeing there?
Okay, we've got white wing bars, orange beak, the tail, black crown, wing stripes.
Very good. So you nailed it. Everyone nailed it. So good job. I like that someone used the word wing bars. So this is a bird that has an example of the wing bars there. So it's a black wing with the white wing bar. It's certainly definitely a yellow bird. It's important to note where you see the yellow. That is the yellow back. Also does have a yellow belly, the orange bill. And then someone who said it had a black crown, which is one way to describe it. You can certainly say a black crown. Another way to describe this is to say it has a black cap. So cap or crown are kind of like interchangeable. And oh, and if you have a guess on the species, go ahead and write that in the chat as well.
We have several guesses for American goldfinch.
Awesome job, everyone. Good job. All right, so taking that really close look at birds and making very careful observations really becomes critical when you need to distinguish similar looking species. So here I have an example of two different egrets, the snowy egret and the gray egret. And by and large, these two birds look really similar. At first glance, you might notice, right away that they're both, big white birds with long necks. But they do have a couple features, a couple field marks that distinguish them. So I want you to go ahead and write in the chat what field marks you see on these two birds here that make them different from one another.
One has an orange bill, golden slippers. Ooh, I like that.
Okay, good. So that's correct. So we've got them. So yes, so the snowy egret has a black bill versus the gray egret, which has a yellow bill. And then, yes, I loved that word, the slippers. That's so cute. Yeah, so the snowy egret has these yellow feet, or toes rather, and the gray egret has black toes. So that's how you can distinguish the two. I will note that one other distinguishing feature about these two birds is that the gray egret is actually much larger than a snowy egret. But you don't always see them together to know that relative size. And if you're seeing it really far away, that can sometimes be really hard to gauge. So then in that case, looking for these particular field marks can be really handy in order to identify it. One last thing I want to note about field marks is that there are plumage variations within a given species. And that's all part of what keeps birding really interesting and makes it challenging and fun. So some of these variations to note is that there are certain species of birds where the males and the females look different. And a northern cardinal is a classic example that you're probably all familiar with, where the males are, bright red and the females are more of a drab brown. Then there are cases where certain species, the adults look very different from the juvenile. So I think a great example of that is a bald eagle. So the first image that might come to your mind when you think of a bald eagle would be that of an adult, where they have that bold white head and the white tail. But those aren't markings that they get until they're about 5 years old. Before that time, they look much more mottled. They sort of like the picture that I have there of an immature eagle, where they're brown, they're mostly brown and kind of speckled white on them. And then there are differences sometimes with the breeding season. So some birds will have a certain appearance and certain field marks when it's the breeding season. So like in spring and summer, versus how they look in the non-breeding season in the fall and winter time. And that can change the seasons throughout those seasons, but breeding seasons vary for different birds. But a good example of that's a good local example is the laughing gull. So laughing gulls, when we see them here, in Virginia Beach on the coast, they have these beautiful striking black hoods on their head. But they lose that feature come the non-breeding season, where they no longer have more of a white head and just a little bit of gray marking on it, remnant from that black hood in the non-breeding season. So again, this is a lot to learn, and I don't want any of you to be discouraged about that because it's not the kind of thing you always have to have memorized. It's sort of something you might learn over time, the more you observe birds, but all of this information can be found in a field guide, and that's part of what makes field guides so important for birding and bird identification. All right, so now.
Sorry, we have a quick question in the chat.
Okay.
Does the gallbill change color as it matures?
Oh, that's a good question. So let me go back. Yeah, I think that what you're seeing there is a breeding or non-breeding season difference as well, where in the breeding season, they have that reddish coloration there in the bill. But I will note for gulls, gulls are a species in many cases where they do look different also as a juvenile from an adult. So oftentimes as a juvenile, there are certain gull species that look very speckled, very mottled, kind of sort of like with the eagle, where they have sort of this like dirty kind of looking appearance because they're so mottled, and then eventually they mature and have that like white and gray kind of coloration. Okay. So that wraps up the 7 keys to bird identification to consider. Now I'm going to go through some practice with you all, where we're going to practice putting all of these different aspects of bird identification together so you get a sense of how this all plays out in real life in the field. So I'm going to ask you to use your imaginations a little bit with this exercise. So I want you to imagine that you are in a woodland, and as you're walking along, you hear a sound. So as you hear that sound, you might already be thinking that it's a woodpecker. And if you were thinking it sounded like a woodpecker, you're right. So it was the drumming of a woodpecker. And then, so say you hear that sound and then you turn to look to see if you can get a look at this woodpecker. And you see that silhouette, and yes, that kind of confirms for you there, oh, indeed, I am hearing a woodpecker. And you know, as you're looking at it, that the size is between that of a robin and a crow. And then you look at it with binoculars and you get that great close-up look of this bird. I'm going to ask you again to write in the chat some of the field marks that you see on this bird. And Molly, go ahead and tell me what people are typing.
Will do. You see the red head and belly, white bars on wings, white breast.
Okay, very good. Very good, thank you. So those are kind of all the distinguishing characteristics, field marks to look at. I will note that one thing that's really important in regards to the red head is to really pay attention, not just to the fact that it's a red head, but where on this bird's head do you see the red? So really think more specifically about it. So notice that red is on top of its head, it's on the crown, and then it extends down the nape of the bird's neck. Now that's going to be important when you're trying to identify and open up a field guide to woodpeckers. So if you look at all the different woodpeckers in the field guide, you'll see that quite a few of them have red on their head. And if that's all you remembered was like, oh, I saw red on the head, or it had a red head, that might leave you wondering, ooh, which species was it? But if you can remember, more specifically that red, oh, it was on the cap, it was down the nape, that's going to help you narrow it down. And if you're looking here, you might be trying to figure out which species it is that we saw. And if you're guessing that it looks like the red-bellied woodpecker, you are correct. So now we're going to try another example here. Again, use your imaginations here. Pretend that you are at a habitat, and it's a lake. You're out at a lake, and it's the summertime, and you hear a call. And that call, you heard it up in the sky. And you look up at the sky and you see the silhouette of this bird flying by. And you note that that bird is between the size of a crow and a goose. So it's a pretty large bird. So then you go to look at it with your binoculars and you get a nice close-up look and you see this bird. So go ahead and type into the chat anything that you see that really stands out to you about this bird as you're observing it. What kind of like unique features or behaviors are you seeing? And Molly, go ahead and let me know what you're seeing.
A lot of people are seeing the black eye line, the feeds on the wing, bright yellow eye, W shape.
Okay, very good. So yeah, a lot of the key things there people are noticing. So yeah, so one thing that's really unique about this bird is the way that it holds its wings. So it holds, is actually the wrist of the bird that it's holding forward like that and making that, people were calling it like a W shape kind of silhouette, which is a good way to describe it. The black eye line through its eye, yes, absolutely, that's a real standout feature. And then that underside of the wings where they have the white kind of under like half of its wing, the front half of its wing, and then the black in the back half. One other thing I would point out is that this bird's carrying a fish in its feet. So that's kind of unique and interesting too. It gives you a sense of what this bird eats. So what you could do now with all of that information is go to your field guide, and you might have enough information there to decide that what you're seeing is a raptor. So you turn to the raptor section, and you could kind of glance through here and see, you know, which bird kind of has the similar markings that you saw on this bird here. And as you scan through, you might decide that you thought it looked the most like the osprey. But if you're not quite sure, go ahead and you would turn to the osprey page in the field guide and you could read a little more information about it. So here it's noting that ospreys are found on open water that harbors fish, that they're usually solitary, and we saw the bird, it was alone, it was not in a flock. That they hover over open water and dive headfirst to catch fish with their feet, and that's unique among raptors. So that fish that it was carrying it was a really good clue there. It also notes about the long crooked wings. So we're seeing a lot of information that matches our observations. You could feel really confident at this point that what in fact you saw was indeed an osprey. Okay, I have one last example here that we'll walk through. So we're in a new habitat this time for you to imagine. You're in a neighborhood, just on a walk in your neighborhood, and you're walking by a bunch of shrubs and trees, and the season is the winter time, and you hear this call. And you get a glance at the bird moving around in the shrubs, and you see its silhouette looks like this. It's a small bird, so it's about the size of a sparrow. And you have your binoculars and you get a close look, and you get to see this bird. So go ahead and observe this bird closely and write what field marks are standing out to you about this bird in the chat.
Yellow rump, ×3, everybody's saying it.
So, okay, good. So you are correct. Those are really good markings that you're all observing there. So yes, the bird has a yellow rump. Good bird word to be using there. And it also has that little patch of yellow under its wing. And again, really important to notice where specifically you see that yellow. So I always refer to that as kind of like the bird's armpit underneath the wing. And then the other feature on its wing are those wing bars, that it has those 2 white stripes on it. So with that information, you could go and turn to your field guide, and what you see there you might have enough info there to decide that based on the size and the silhouette and like this yellow and coloration in the bird, that it was a warbler. And look at this field guide. So this is a great example of how when you see a bird, you really need to notice exactly like where you see certain colors, because if you walked away from this bird just remembering that it was a bird that had yellow on it, and you turn to this warbler page, you'd be kind of lost there as to try and figure out which warbler it was. But since you were so astute to notice that it was the yellow rump and that yellow and that sort of armpit of the under the wing, that can help you narrow it down. And you might guess that this could be the yellow rumped warbler. But if you're not sure, you would turn to read more information about it. And here in the field guide, it describes that this is a bird in the wintertime that is seen in open brushy habitats, especially fruiting shrubs. So that kind of matches sort of the other information we had about the bird, that we observed it in the wintertime and that we saw it in some shrubs. So, and then again, looking at those markings, again, notice the plumage variations that you're seeing there, how it's different in the breeding season versus in the winter time. But you saw this bird in the winter and it matches. So you can feel confident knowing that you were correct in deciding it was a yellow rumped warbler. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the little practice exercise I wanted to walk you through. I hope that all of this information I shared with you about bird identification has inspired you to give it a try and go out and do it on your own. And I have a few more tips here for you to help you get started. So first and foremost, the tip that I want to recommend for all of you is to think about joining a bird club if you're not already in one. That's one of the best ways to get better at birding, is to bird with other people. So we're really lucky here in Southeast Virginia. There's a lot of bird clubs around here. If you happen to be tuning in from elsewhere in the state, you can find your local bird club by going to the Virginia Society of Ornithology website. So that's a statewide organization, and they list different local bird clubs. Another thing I'd encourage all of you to do is to get a field guide and to start studying it and just kind of learn different birds over time. I have some recommendations on field guides on my next slides. Also consider buying binoculars if you don't have any, because that's what's going to give you those really beautiful close-up looks at birds. And that's, as you get more into birding, you're gonna want to have that nice look at those birds. And I have some recommendations on binoculars as well. And then finally, just like any hobby, you've got to practice to get better. So just practice and observe birds closely every time you see them. Keep your binoculars handy, at your window if you have a bird feeder, so that you can be checking all those birds out. So for field guides, this is kind of the group of different field guides that I recommend. All of these ones I'm showing you here are good. My most favorite is the Sibley, because I really love its detailed illustrations, but the National Geographic one is also really good and has fantastic illustrations in it. And Peterson's also good too. I will say the thing that's nice is Peterson has it broken down as the Eastern versus Western birds, which can be kind of nice to just kind of simplify the birds that you're looking up to your local area. And then the Kaufman guide is kind of different because it uses photos instead of illustrations. It also has a Spanish language version available if that's something that you're interested in. And then for learning bird songs and calls, there's different CDs that you can get. So Peterson has one, and then the Stokes has one. All of the calls and songs that I played in this presentation were part of that Stokes field guide. And they have, you can also download those as MP3s, which you can then put on your phone, and that's nice too. There's also websites and apps that are really helpful. A great one is the Cornell's All About Birds website. And audubon.org is also a great website as well. Both of those have just a fantastic resource of information about bird identification and descriptions. They're sort of like their own online field guide. If you prefer to have an app, which is kind of nice to carry out in the field because it's easier, you can just have it on your phone instead of carrying a heavy book with you in the field. Audubon has a free app you can download. There's a Sibley field guide as well for your phone. That one you have to pay for. The Audubon one's free. And then another really cool app is Merlin, which is made by Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And that actually will walk you through the 7 keys to bird identification that I had in this presentation to help narrow down the possible birds that you might have seen. So you can it'll ask you questions and you answer them, and then it'll give you a selection of birds to choose from to identify it. So it's a really cool app, particularly when you're just first starting out birding. It's really helpful. Another website I want to mention is eBird. eBird is a community science database that anybody can use. And it has a ton of information about bird observations really around the world, because it takes data that anyone can enter, and then anyone can access that data to see where certain species are found, or where there's different like birding hotspots and things like that. But another cool aspect of it is you can, as you enter this data in there of your bird observations, it tracks a life list for you. So a life list is a term birders use to describe all the birds they've ever seen in their life. And it's kind of a fun thing to keep track of. And using eBird makes that really easy to do that. And then the cool part is that contributes to science. So this data that's in eBird is used by ornithologists around the world to help with bird conservation. So I definitely encourage you to check out eBird. And it has an app you can use for your phone too. So when you're out in the field and you want to keep track of the birds you saw, you can use the app and make a little list, checklist for yourself. And now I just want to talk about binoculars really quick. The best size binocular to get would be an 8x42. That's sort of considered the standard birding binocular. 8 stands for the magnification power. Don't really recommend going above an 8, although it can be tempting. But if you go higher than an 8, that can make your binoculars appear like very shaky as you look through them. And then that 42, that stands for the objective lens diameter. And that by going with a 42, that lets in a lot of light. And so that helps you see a bright image, which is really desirable for birding and noting a bird's field marks and colors and things like that. And then finally, this combination of an 8x42, it gives you a nice wide field of view, which is important because birds are always busy and on the move and flying and hopping around. So if you have that wide field of view, it gives you a better chance of seeing the bird. As far as the best places to go birding, thinking about birds in Virginia, I really encourage you to use our Virginia Bird and Wildlife Trail. So that's a guide to all of the best spots to go birding in Virginia, which you can find on our agency's website, again, the Department of Wildlife Resources. And we're basically wherever you are in Virginia, you can find these fantastic birding spots to go. Virginia Beach even has its own loop on the Bird Wildlife Trail called the Seashore to Cypress Loop. So again, that's an online guide you can find on our website. In terms of best time of day, birding is really like a morning kind of activity because that's when the birds are the most active and you're going to see the most diversity of birds. So you want to get out there early, although sometimes at dusk, just before sunset can be good too, because sometimes birds are out feeding again at that time of day. And in Virginia, we're really lucky because in terms of season for birding, it's really a year-round kind of activity. Surprisingly, the one season that's maybe like not as exciting as others is the summer, but every other season is a really fantastic time. Particularly spring is my favorite because that's when you have birds migrating through. Birds are entering their breeding season, so they're full, beautiful coloration. They're actively singing, so that's really a superb time to go birding. But also fall is good because they're migrating again, so again, you get a nice diversity of birds. And then winter is really special here in the area where we live down here in Southeast Virginia. That's why we have the Winter Wildlife Festival, because we get a whole bunch of birds from parts north that spend the winter here. And so we get a whole suite of interesting, waterfowl and seabirds to see that we don't at other times of year. All right, so now I just have a few tips for you on how to spot birds in the field. So really, when you go out birding, the most important thing to do is to just really tune into nature. Awaken your senses, really dial in. You want to walk slow and quiet so you can hear the birds and not disturb them. You want to keep your eyes peeled and be listening the whole time. So listening for bird sounds as you're walking. If you hear an interesting one, you want to hone in on it. You want to think, where exactly is that sound coming from? And then you want to look for that bird where the sound was. And you want to use your naked eye. So not the binoculars just yet. It's easier to spot the bird with just your naked eye first. So just scan the area where the sound is coming from, and you want to be looking for the movement and the shape of the bird. Sort of like if you look at this picture I have here, and you look at that picture and you're trying to find how many birds do you see in that picture. That's the same sort of exercise you want to do when you're out looking. You're looking for movement of a bird, you're looking for the shape of a bird. And if you thought there were 3 birds in that image, you are correct. And then finally, once you've spotted the bird, you want to try and get your binoculars on it. And the thing to do there is after you've spotted, you keep your eye on the bird, and then you want to raise your binoculars up for that better look. When you're birding out in a group, you want to try and help each other spot a bird. So if you're out birding, with a group on a field trip or with a bird club, you might hear the trip leader saying, oh, I see a bird at 12 o'clock, or I see a bird at 9 o'clock. And what they're doing there is they're imagining a tree as a clock face to help describe the bird is so that everyone in the group can see it. So I do have a bird in this tree, and go ahead, if you see that bird in the tree, type into the chat how you would describe that bird's location. And Molly, go ahead and tell me what people are typing.
All right, we see the bird at 2 o'clock.
Correct. Okay, good job, everyone. And then the last thing I just want to leave you with here is just to remember, when you're out birding, have a great time, but always be mindful while you're out birding. You want to practice outdoor ethics. Just the old adage of take nothing but photos, leave nothing but footprints. You also want to respect birds and other wildlife while you're out there. So even though you're really eager and super excited to get close-up looks at birds or any other animals, it's so important not to chase them or to interfere with their activities. You don't want to cause these animals stress in any way or put yourself in danger. So always keep a respectful distance. When it comes to birds, if you find that birds are like flushing, like quickly flying away as you're walking, or if they're mobbing you, so like a whole bunch of birds are like coming at you, or if birds are like clacking their bills at you, these are all kind of signs that you're too close to that bird and you're causing them stress. So that's the time to know that you need to back up. And lastly, just some good birding manners in terms of like birding with groups and other people. Remember to keep your voice down, even though it is a social activity. Remember that people are trying to listen to birds too. So you can't hear the birds if you're all kind of like, everyone's like talking loudly. So just something to be mindful about. Always help each other spot the birds, try and be helpful. Birding is a real joy, and even people who are really seasoned sometimes just can't spot the bird. Maybe they're not standing in the right spot, but everyone wants to see it. So help each other out, make it fun for everyone. And our agency has this phrase we like to use a lot lately called the outdoors are better together. So just always remember, make it fun for everyone, and everyone deserves to experience the joy of birding. So that's all I have for my presentation here. I want to thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to join me to learn about birds, and for your interest in bird identification and trying out birding and learning more about it. I do have just a schedule of other activities coming up that are part of Winter Wildlife Festival that I'd encourage you to join if you're not already signed up for. So we have our virtual keynote with Jennifer Ackerman, who's an author of The Bird Way. She's going to be presenting on that book in this virtual presentation on Friday night. Saturday is my field session that kind of accompanies this workshop. I may or may not have space available. You can check that out on the website for that. But for those of you who are joining, I can't wait to meet you there. There's an exhibit hall on Saturday that's open to the public. And on Sunday, I have another introductory bird trip planned called Birds in the City. I think I still have openings for as well, so you could join me there. And we have a photography contest going on, which anyone can enter. So I'd encourage you to check that out on the festival website. So, that's everything I have that I wanted to share with you all, other than just to stay in touch with our agency. And if there's time, I'm happy to take some questions.
Yeah, so one of the questions we got is, where are your favorite places to bird locally? So in the Hampton Roads area.
Fabulous question. Great question. Gosh, there's some really good places to go. So in just the broader Hampton Roads area, I would say Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge is outstanding, as well as Back Bay National Wildlife Refuge. I really love Pleasure House Point Natural Area, which it's with the City of Virginia Beach owns that. That's an outstanding spot. First Landing is always nice too. Those are kind of some of my standout favorite places to go, but there are so many good ones in this local area. We're really lucky. And if you ever have time to make it up to the Eastern Shore, there are countless amazing places to go on the Eastern Shore birding as well. And one other kind of nearby spot, Hampton Roads, that's pretty cool place to go birding is Fort Monroe as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, I haven't seen any other questions pop up. So I just want to say thank you so much, Jessica. That was an awesome presentation. I definitely learned a ton from it. And thank you everyone for attending. Just a reminder, a recording of this session will be sent to you via email, but be a little bit patient with us. We're working on getting them out as quickly as possible. So look for that within the next couple days. And yeah, we hope you guys join us for some other stuff during the Winter Wildlife Festival. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and end the Zoom call now. And I hope you guys all have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone.